Her usual thing to say, though, is, "I've already heard that." My granddaddy drank whiskey. And not the good stuff either. It was cheap, nasty rye whiskey, but he always treated it like it was the finest Kentucky bourbon. And he smoked cigarettes too. They were hand-rolled on zigzag papers from Sportsman medium cut tobacco from a yellow tin. Every Friday night, my family would visit my grandparents. My mother and my father and my grandmother would go into the living room and watch TV and drink coffee. My grandfather and I would sit by ourselves at the kitchen table. This all started when I was about 3 years old. He'd go to the cupboard and get a glass and put it down on the table. He'd fill it with green Kool-Aid and he'd put a couple of cookies down where I sat. And I would go to the cupboard under the sink and I would get his bottle of whiskey and his shot glass. And I'd walk back to the table and put that glass down where he sat, and I'd fill it very carefully with that bottle with both of my hands. I never spilled a drop. I knew exactly how important my job was. We'd sit at that table. He'd pull that tin of tobacco over, he'd open it up, he'd hand me that flap of zigzag papers, I'd pull one out of it, and I'd hold it between my 3 fingers like he showed me. He'd take a pinch of that tobacco and he'd lay it in that paper. And he'd take it from me in those big hands of his and he'd roll it and he'd tuck it and he'd tuck it and he'd roll it till it was just right. And then he'd run his tongue down that glue strip, tweak it a couple of times, and as if by magic, in his hand would appear a perfect cigarette. I'd reach out, I'd get that box of wooden kitchen matches, and with my little hands, I'd take one of those matches, I'd scratch it down the side, I'd hold that flame up, he'd put that cigarette between his lips, he'd dip it down into the flame. And then he'd reach out, he'd pick up that shot glass, and he'd sit back, just half of it, and put it back on the table. Always just half. He'd sit back, he'd look at me, and he'd say, "My boy, there is no greater solace to a man than the solace brought by fine tobacco and good whiskey." And then he'd tell me stories. Oh, Lord, he'd tell me stories about when he fought in the trenches in World War I. He'd tell me stories about riding the deck of a schooner in a full gale off the Grand Banks in Newfoundland. He'd tell me about prize fights he had been in. He'd tell me about 1,000 different scrapes he had been in. And once, he showed me a picture of a naked lady he had tattooed on his arm and how she danced when he wiggled his fingers, but my grandmother found out he only ever showed me that once. And this is the way I spent every Friday night for my whole childhood. Every Friday night sitting at that table. But one night was a little different. When I was 5 years old, one night was a little different. We sat down at that table and he filled my glass and I filled his glass. And he reached over, he got that tin of tobacco, he pulled it over, I pulled out that zigzag like I always did, and I held it in my hand. Only this night, for some reason, I got it in my head. I reached into that tin of tobacco myself. And I laid that tobacco down in the paper. And in my little tiny fingers, I rolled it, and I tucked it, and I tucked it, and I rolled it like I had seen my grandfather do 1,000 times. Until it seemed just so, till it seemed just right, and then I ran my tongue down that glue strip. And amazing myself as much as anyone else, there in my hand appeared a perfect cigarette. My grandfather looked at that and took it from me, put it between his lips, and while he did, I reached out, I struck that kitchen match, and I held up that flame. He dipped the tip of that cigarette into it, and he drew on it, and the end glowed like a hot cherry. He looked at me long and hard. He picked up that shot glass and he looked at it. Never taking his eyes off of me, he sipped back just half of that whiskey and laid it on the table. And there was a silence for a little while, and he looked at me and he said quietly, he said, "My boy, I've told you so many times that there is no greater solace to a man than the solace brought by fine tobacco and good whiskey. And tonight, you have brought me both of those things. And I thank you for that. You're a damn fine man." And I felt 10 feet tall. Lord, I felt 10 feet tall. And then my grandfather did something he'd never done before. He pulled that cigarette out from between his lips. He reached out and grabbed me by the wrist. He put that cigarette between my fingers. And I sat back in my chair, I put that cigarette up, and I took my first small puff. And for as long as I live, I will never forget how that tobacco smoke tasted the first time it ever touched my tongue. But the thing that will stick with me forever from that night was holding that cigarette up, looking past the smoking end, through the kitchen door into the living room and straight into the eyes of my mother, who was looking back at me, taking my first drag off a cigarette, 5 years old. And then the strangled, choking sound she made as she got up out of that chair and came walking across that living room like some kind of homicidal robot on a mission of murder. And my granddaddy heard the noise she made. He turned around, he saw her, he kind of jumped a little bit. But then he turned back to me and he looked at me and his eyes sparkled and shone with the light of absolute evil wickedness. And he winked at me, he laid his hand flat on the table and he said, "We're in a lot of trouble, boy." Pushed that shot glass across at me and said, "May as well drink up."
Pooping in the woods can be a very frightening experience, especially for someone who's never been camping before. The idea of pulling down your pants and exposing your bare, pale flesh to the horrors that the woods might have in store for you, slimy or pokey or bitey, that can be a really frightening thing, especially for someone who hasn't been camping before. So when I started my job as a wilderness camp counselor leading canoe trips, I knew that I had to be prepared to talk my campers through these unimaginable horrors. My first ever canoe trip was with a group of 11-year-olds who, again, had never been camping before, and I decided I was going to be incredibly thorough. I listened to all of their anxieties about what it meant to spend a night in the woods, and most of them had to do with pooping in the woods. And so we talked a lot before we left on this trip about what that looked like. How most of our campsites are going to have what we call pit toilets, which are kind of like a porta potty but without the walls, and that you can put your toilet paper in those after you finish. How if you ever have to go to the bathroom when we don't have one of those pit toilets, we'll talk about digging a hole, you know, of the proper depth, and how important it is to dispose of our waste and our trash in a very responsible way. But I never explicitly said, sit on the seat and poop in the hole. And so they didn't. They told me, this is my first night on the job, they came back from the toilet and gleefully told me that they had sat on a log nearby, pooped right on the ground, and then, like I had instructed, put the toilet paper into the hole. And I didn't even know what to say. I prepared them so well. Like, why? What? Why? But then I started to think about it and put myself in the shoes of an 11-year-old and how scary it must be, not only to be away from home for the first time, but to be sleeping in a tent with a bunch of people you don't know who smell really, really bad. And how maybe taking a shit on the open forest floor is a way of taking control over that. Saying, fuck you to nature and all of the scary, scary things that lie behind each leaf. And I was reminded again of how scary these things can be. Later that night, in the tent, after we had said our goodnights, when one of my campers sat up and had a severe, severe panic attack. She was hyperventilating, she was crying, she was unresponsive to taps on the shoulder or consoling words or anything like that. And I had no idea what to do. This camp trains us very thoroughly. I'd taken an 8-day wilderness first responder course where I was literally qualified to deliver a baby in the woods, like to help someone give birth. But I had no idea what to do when someone was having a panic attack. So I remembered one of my friends telling me that sometimes visualization helps her when she's panicking. And so I just started talking to this camper and started telling her that she was so brave and so strong for coming so far away from home and doing something that was so, so new. And I remembered just talking her through that the trees, the ones that she'd fertilized with her shit, the trees, they were expelling all of this clean, cleansing air that she was breathing in and breathing out, all this stress, and breathing in and out. And I was trying to sound so calm, but I was shaking inside too because I barely felt qualified to be there, let alone to be talking her through it. Like even now, a couple years later, I still text my mom and ask her which clothing item goes in which setting of the laundry machine. And so I had no idea what I was doing. But eventually she started breathing and she started talking to us and even joking with us. And I just felt so proud and so just inspired, because it's so scary lying in a tent and there's trees creaking over you and water lapping against the rocks, and it's so easy to remember how small you are and how insignificant you are and how far away from any type of civilization you are. And the fact that she was only 11, she had just gone away from home for the first time, she'd figured all of that out and then started joking with us, that was unimaginable. So I was so ready to do whatever she needed. And so her final request before going to bed was one last lullaby. And I'm not a very good singer, but I pulled out my little trusty camp ukulele and started singing some song, and it was pretty abysmal, but I sang it for her. And when I finished, she looked up at me and she said, "You are the best singer in the whole world." Aww. Besides Beyonce. Yeah, besides Beyonce. And I remember thinking, if that's the takeaway from today, after I've bumbled my way through helping someone through a panic attack, after I've let my campers shit on the open forest floor, if the takeaway from that is that I'm second best to Beyonce in anything, I'll take it. Thank you.
Some people travel light, while others pack a full-on suitcase for a weekend trip to Victoria. Packing for travel is one thing, but packing your life in a suitcase to move to a whole new country is a completely different process. Every item is thought of not only once or twice, but over a dozen times. You choose what memories to bring with you and what memories to leave behind. Leaving Syria was one of the toughest things that I had to do in my life. And every item I have in my suitcase has a story. And today's story is about a scarf that I brought with me from Damascus. You see, I was head over heels in love with Damascus way before I had to leave her. The oldest inhabited capital in the world. The stones of its alleys will speak, and you will hear them tell stories about our ancestors that walked the same path thousands of years ago. The city that has seen civilizations rise and fall, and the smell of its jasmine will enrich your soul with every single breath you take. One summer, I had this massive urge of exploring the old part of the city, Dimashq al-Qadim. And that is within the walls that were once contained the whole city. The high walls of the castle that only had 7 doors to access the city through. I wanted to know its ins and outs. And just like falling in love with a new lover, I wanted to get to know her like I know the back of my hand. I would free fall myself deep inside within the veins of the city and make my way out towards the surface. For strangers, it might seem like a complicated maze, but for me, it was like walking a labyrinth. The first time, it happened by complete coincidence. I found a Western tourist holding his paper map in one of the small alleys, confused and not knowing where to go and what to do. This is way before smartphones invaded the world and before Google Maps existed, at least not in Syria. And I had time to spare, so I approached him and I'm like, "Are you lost? Do you need help?" And he said, "Yes, I don't know where to go. I want to go to this place." And I'm like, "Okay, I have a few hours to spare, but that is not my direction. I'd love to take you into that direction and show you gems that you wouldn't find on the map." And he agreed. And I took him over and I showed him Damascus from my eyes. And he was fascinated. I could feel the happiness within his soul. I wanted that smile again from another person. So for the next few months, I would get lost in old Damascus, find tourists that don't know what to do, and basically take them around the city and show them Damascus from my eyes. And throughout this journey, of course, they want to shop for souvenirs, and there was one shop. I think the owner was called Abu Muhammad, I'm not really sure of the name. He owned a shop that only sold shawls and scarves in Damascus. And one time, I had 3 French tourists with me. They walked in and they were losing themselves within the shop, and I was sitting with Abu Muhammad on 2 small chairs next to the door outside, sipping our Arabic coffee, listening to the call of prayer from the Umayyad Mosque combined with the bells of churches from the old city, and watching the pigeons fly away. The tourists end up buying a lot of things from that shop. And Abu Muhammad was very happy and grateful. As I was saying bye to him, he was offering me money. He thought that I was a tour guide and he was giving me my cut because they made a really good deal. But I refused to take the money. I'm not a tour guide, I'm just bringing you people, you know? And you know how when you're on a first date and the bill comes and you know this, like the bill dance when you're like, I'm gonna pay, no, I'm gonna pay, and you know, so we were kind of having that dance of him wanting to offer me the money and me being stubborn, like, no, I'm not gonna take your money. And he at some point realized how stubborn I was, and he was like, okay, well, at least pick a scarf. And I was an 18-year-old basketball player who had no interest in scarves or wearing scarves, but I was like, okay. I walked in and I looked at the corner where the cheaper scarves were there, and I bought a colorful one. Like I picked up a colorful one. He put it in a white plastic bag dotted with golden dots, and I took that bag and I put it in my drawer, and then I took that bag from my drawer and I put it in my suitcase. It traveled with me to so many different places, and it made its way to Vancouver last year, where I put it with its bag in its drawer. And today, I decided to open the drawer and open the bag for the first time to tell you its story. Thank you.
Forces Base, Shiloh, Manitoba. I've just finished my lifeguard shift at the local pool. I'm trudging home, filled with dread and anxiety. I have to make an admission to my parents. I'm going to get in trouble, and potentially, so is my dad. I've just been visited at work by a military police officer, or MP. The previous weekend, some high school kids had been caught in the barracks, the housing for the base's single men. Pressured into naming other offenders, they disclosed my name, along with that of my army guy boyfriend, Peter. The MP asked me if I'd been in Peter's barracks. He asked me if I'd been drinking. I grew up on military bases. We all knew girls were forbidden in the barracks. The only thing worse than being in the barracks was drinking in the barracks, which is exactly what I'd been doing that night. Standing there in my bathing suit, caught off guard, protected only by my lifeguard t-shirt and whistle, I stammer out unconvincing denials. Undeterred, he comes to the crux of the matter. Did my father know I hung out at the barracks? What would my father think of that? My terror and shame rendered me silent. But I knew the answers. My father didn't know, and he wouldn't like it. We all lived with the cautionary tales of the families who were kicked off base or posted to another location because of socially unacceptable behavior, particularly that of the girls or women. I arrive home. My parents are sitting in the living room watching TV. I march past them, visibly upset. I beeline for my bedroom, knowing my mum will follow. I huddle on my bed. My sense of impending doom grows with every step I hear my mum taking up the steps. She comes in, sits on the bed. What's going on? Looking down, wringing my hands, choking back tears, I admit. Last Saturday night, when I told her I'd gone roller skating in Brandon, I was at Peter's barracks. The military police knew they had come to the pool and questioned me. I take a deep breath and look up. I see her initial relief. This makes sense given the multiple possible catastrophes her mind had likely generated in the moment it took her to get to my room. I also see that, although her brow is furrowed, she's possibly suppressing a smile. After all, she did marry her own army guy boyfriend, my dad, when she was 19. But I do see that she's angry, as I anticipated. She questions me, and I answer honestly. She is furious. But with each of her questions, I'm coming to the growing realization she is angry at the military police. She springs into action, marches to the phone, dials them up, demands an immediate visit from the MP who'd come to the pool. We return to the living room. My mom tells my dad he should make himself scarce, which he does. Both of them are acting in accordance with the spoken and unspoken rules of rank and protocol relating to military life. This is my mom's battle, and my dad needs to absent himself so she can fulfill it without constraint. The MP shows up, perches nervously on our couch. I sit beside my mom. She proceeds to interrogate him, as he had me. She repeats each question I told her he'd asked me. He denies each one. I did not say that, ma'am. I did not say that, ma'am. She then pronounces judgment. She tells him his behavior is unacceptable. She tells him he jeopardized the safety of the swimmers who I was responsible for as a lifeguard. She tells him not to go to the pool again. She tells him if he ever has any reason to speak with either of her daughters again, he is to contact her. She escorts him out of the house. My dad returns from the rec room. None of us heard anything further about this matter. Well, not from the police. I was still grounded. The police behavior did not grant me absolution. First things first, stand up for the daughter. Second, ground the allegedly roller skating daughter. Both my parents had my back that night. My mom stood up for me in the face of authority. I like to believe I do the same for my daughter. She's 19 now, the way my mom did for me back then, and the way she still does. She's 72 now, 5 foot nothing, green and purple hair, frequently attired in crazy cat lady leggings and sweaters. But as it was then, mess with me and you'll have her to answer to.